Today we're going to talk about this book called The Color of Law by Richard Rothstein. Well, and we'll have a disclaimer even right now that it's an alarming read, that it is a sad read, that I feel very lucky that I can actually just read about this stuff in books as opposed to experience it. Unfortunately, like many African Americans, African Canadians, anyone of color really, that I can simply read about it and that I can avoid most of it day to day, really, as far as my life experience. And yeah, so that's it. This is a book about, well, it says right there, a forgotten history of how our government segregated America. So how it made sure that black people didn't live near white people via some of its laws. And then when those laws were struck down by not taking action when people were violating those laws. Before we dive into that, there are a few ways you can support the channel. Number one is you could become a member on YouTube. It should just be right there. Become a member. See if you like the video. You can do a super thanks too, which is just gives me some money for the video. You can also go take one of my courses on Skillshare. You're probably interested in the one on Zettelkasten, which you can find below. You can go to curtismchale.ca/Skillshare, and that will just take you there, and I will get some affiliate fees for you joining. But now, let's buckle up and look at The Color of Law. So, what this book is about, what it really brought home to me is the lengths that a white-run government will go to perform mental and legal gymnastics to make sure that black people get as little as possible. The Color of Law brings into stark relief how generational wealth was stolen from African Americans, and how even laws that were struck down as unconstitutional were kind of enforced, because like the police would do nothing when white people would go like trash a black person's house. They just didn't care, and that's devastating. That's devastating. So let's start with just a few points. We're only going to cover a few of the many sad points here. First off is how veterans were tossed away. So when veterans came home from World War II, they should have had access to mortgages that the U.S. government and the U.S. Veterans Association were going to provide to get them into the housing market as, kind of a thanks. There's also some undertones of avoiding communism there by getting people involved in capitalism. So if they had a house, they'd be involved in capitalism. The real truth here is that only white veterans had this access, while African American veterans were specifically excluded. They're excluded by not being allowed mortgage insurance by the mortgage insurance brokers. So then they couldn't get a mortgage, essentially. Their housing prices were inflated then, and they had to do more deposits. They had to pay more for the house. And then even back on the tax assessment end, their houses were assessed as worth more, so they had to pay more taxes, while white houses were assessed as worth less, so white people had to pay less taxes. Yeah, which again, just theft of generational wealth. I saw that this still happens specifically with lower income houses. So houses that are worth less actually get assessed as more, whereas houses that are worth more get assessed as less. So poor people are continuing to pay more for their housing. Yeah, which, because of all the stuff, part of the stuff that happened here is more likely to include immigrants, African Americans, people that aren't white. And then there was a whole undertone of all this private action that prevented racial mixing. So they do restrictive covenants. So I'd sign something when I wrote my house. It was actually written into the document by the builders at the request of the mortgage people sometimes, where they would say, I will not sell to a black person. And then if you did, it became like you would get sued for it. That was the goal, that you just didn't want to sell to a black person, because then you would get sued. And even when these were struck down as unconstitutional, that you couldn't have them, and unenforceable by the Supreme Court in, was it 1948? It still took until 1962 when John F. Kennedy said, you can't do this anymore, as a presidential executive order. And then the U.S. Housing Administration started to take action on it. They say you'll actually find some houses, at least in the U.S., that still have these on the books, even though they're entirely unenforceable, and they're really hard to get off your deed because they're actually tied to the house, to the land. They actually recommended, the book said, leave it on there. Use it as a teaching tool. Like, remind yourself about what has been specifically and purposefully inflicted on Black people. So, and even when these became unenforceable, they, like white neighborhoods, basically rose up and would trash Black houses, while police stood by. They just stand by and watch. So, if the government, if the federal, provincial, here, state level institutions are specifically avoiding and ignoring crimes, then they are complicit in them. And they are de facto, I don't know if de facto, there's a whole long discussion about de facto and de jure and the difference between that. I would say I read through it a bunch of times and I'm still wrapping my mind around it, so I'm not actually diving into it. Ultimately, the book is saying that because the government did nothing about it and the federal institutions did nothing about like obvious breaking of the law, they're at fault here, and they basically supported racism for a long time. And I think there'd be a good argument that they still do. If we watch how the police victimize Black people, First Nations in Canada, Black people in Canada as well, then we'd have to say that the government is still complicit and still is pushing racism because they're not enforcing the actual laws on their officers. Yeah. So, should you read The Color of Law? I think you should. Even though it should make you angry. It should make you angry. If for an African American, this might be a good insight into some of the history. It would make you angry. As a white person, it makes me angry to see that people will be treated like this, and to recognize that they probably still are. And not even probably, they still are being treated like this. It's a tough book, but I always figure as long as those around me, African Americans, anyone, First Nations in Canada, Indigenous people in other places, as long as they have to deal with the aftermath of these acts, as long as they are still dealing currently with these practices, then I should be able to read about it. I got a pretty easy life here as a white dude. I should be able to read about it and wrestle through it and work through and understand, try to develop what I will do about it. Yeah. What can I do about it? Anyway, that's the book, The Color of Law by, here it is, Richard Rothstein. Recommended book. I'll be putting this on my shelf. It's a keeper. I'm sure I will refer to it again as I look at more stuff around community building. That's it. If you like the video, thumbs up below. If you love that, you can subscribe. And YouTube says I should tell you to hit the bell. But I think that you have better things to do than just wait for YouTube notifications. So hit the bell. Don't hit the bell, but turn your notifications off because you go read a book instead, in truth. You can also become a YouTube member. YouTube members will get some videos early. You can also go to Skillshare, become one of my students, learn how I take notes or how I got started with Zettelkasten. That's it. Have a good one.